The, the Rwandan Genocide lasted just 100 days, yet Human Rights Watch estimates over 500,000 people were killed. Other estimates, the number could be as many as 1 million. The 1994 genocide was the culmination of long-standing tensions between the minority Tutsi and who had controlled power for centuries, and the majority Hutu peoples who had come to power in the rebellion in the early 1960s. Tutsi and pro-peace Hutus were targets in the mass killings, although many describe indiscriminate killings and violence during that time too. In the early 1990s, Carl Wilkens was in Rwanda with his wife and 3 children, serving as head of the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, an arm of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When violence erupted in 1994, he decided to remain in Rwanda, the only American to do so. He's written a book, I'm Not Leaving, about his experiences during the 100 days of the genocide. Carl Wilkens joins me in the studio. Thanks for being here.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
All right, let's start the conversation by having you read 2 short paragraphs from the introduction to your book, because it sort of summarizes so well what your book is about.
Okay. While the stories written here happened during the genocide, this book is not really about genocide. It's more about the choices people made, actions people took, courage people showed, and sacrifices people gave in the face of genocide. One of my hopes is that the stories contained here will help us each see something of ourselves in the people who survived this 100-day calamity and those who did not. Perhaps glimpses of things wanted in our own lives will be seen, as well as glimpses of things we most definitely do not want. My other hope is that these stories will connect in a way that will move each of us deeper in our commitment to end genocide.
Now, you were in the capital of Rwanda with your wife and 3 children, as we mentioned, in the 1990s. You were doing development work. 1994, the fighting between the Rwandan Patriotic Front, comprised mainly of Tutsis, and the government, mainly comprised of Hutus, made it to the capital. Things deteriorated rapidly, and you were able to hear gunfire and explosions from your home. Bring us to that. Basically, the first thing that set all this off was the plane crash with the president.
Yeah. You know, we had a 3-year war, and actually they had brokered a ceasefire the previous year, and we were all super optimistic that a new broad-based government would be installed. Everybody would be represented in this government. But this small group of extremists, we find out later, was doing everything in their power to derail this new government, and so it was delayed. January 94, February, March, April. You're having also some different demonstrations, some political party leaders killed, some massacres of people. So we're in tension, and I think it was probably in March I sent a fax to the headquarters of the Adventist Church, which was in charge of the Adventist Development Relief Agency, the group we were working with. Sent a fax to headquarters saying it's like we're sitting on a keg of dynamite, but we have plans. If this thing blows, we're not caught unprepared. We have evacuation plans in place with the embassy, assembly points, but we're all just hoping against hope that this new government will be installed and will diffuse all the tension that has been building. And then, Wednesday night, we heard the explosion at our house and didn't know what it was. Actually, my parents were visiting at the time, and I said to my dad, boy, that sounded louder than normal, because there had been grenades or other things. It was kind of, with democracy, unfortunately in Rwanda, forced on democracy brought a kind of chaos and lawlessness before the genocide. So then when we find out about an hour later that it was the president's plane that was shot down, and the gunfire starts, we're like, whoa, this is not good, but we just didn't really know how not good it was going to be.
So foreigners were making arrangements to evacuate, and it becomes clear to your family that your family's at risk here. So your wife, Teresa, your 3 children, and your parents decide to evacuate. And you and your wife decide that you're going to stay. And she was on board with this, which I thought, I don't know if I would have that same. And I'm sure she didn't realize how bad it, nor did you, how bad it was going to get.
We all look at it in the context of a genocide, but at that point it was bad, but yeah.
Not that. So talk about your decision to stay.
Well, it really started for us, I think, with a young lady who lived and worked in our home. She'd been there for like 3 years. The kids loved her. My wife and I loved her. And then there was a young man who came in the evening as a watchman, and they both had Tutsi ID cards. And, the extremists have been constructing this enemy and building this sense of fear. And so when it erupts and they start killing, the American embassy makes it really clear as the evacuation plans are coming in place, no Rwandans in the vehicles. And you look back on this, and on one hand you see the sense where like, well, we'll put other people's lives at danger, but then what's going to happen for the Rwandans? What you can't just say, well, so that we'll be safe, you can't get in the car, and so my wife and I, we couldn't. We just we talked, we prayed. We'd been in Africa for 10 years by now. Our 2 daughters had been born. Our son was born in America, but our girls had been born while we lived in Africa. So it was home in many ways. And like you said, we didn't know how long or how bad, but we just figured we couldn't leave this young lady and this young man to be slaughtered.
Right. So you thought by your presence being there, you would be able to protect them?
Hopefully. There was this great respect for foreigners that you enjoyed in Rwanda. Often when I'm talking in schools here in America, I'm like, this is going to be hard to communicate because foreigners don't hold that great welcome respect in America in a large scale like it was in Rwanda. So just hoping that my presence would be able to keep them out of the house. And we figured 2 weeks maximum. When I say goodbye to Teresa, this can't last more than 2 weeks, and probably in 3 weeks you'll be back with the kids. But it was actually 3 weeks before I left the house.
Now you mentioned the ID cards. So this identified every person, whether you were Hutu or Tutsi, and so it was easy to figure out who was who.
Yeah, the cards were huge in this because you couldn't often tell the difference. The people spoke the same language. They married each other, honestly, by the thousands. So a lot of people think, oh, they hated each other and a genocide started. No, it was politically driven. And without those ID cards, it would have been really hard. I mean, there were cases when, one person pointed out another, they knew their family history. But the ID cards that the Belgians had brought to Rwanda were a key part in eliminating the quote, enemy.
Now, in addition to the young woman and young man that you were staying to protect, you also had a pastor and his wife come to stay in your home during that 3 months. They played a really big role in this.
People, it's so hard when you're telling the story to somebody, there's so many parts you want to include. And this man and his wife, they had Hutu ID cards, they had a car, they could have fled if they wanted to, like many people with cars did. It wasn't just foreigners who were fleeing. It was the poor person who didn't have a car and tried to flee on foot that the government turned back and said, go defend your neighborhood. But without them in the house, I don't know what I would have done without his wisdom. And she was the first one who'd go to the gate when the killing squad or soldiers would show up rattling a chain on our gate. She'd go talk to him like a mom, like an aunt, and she was great at diffusing. And well, if she couldn't, then eventually I'd end up down at the gate. She'd buy stolen food it's not like we had a choice what kind of food we got, but she'd buy toilet paper over the fence. She played that key role in kind of keeping us supplied, and he played an incredibly important role in, after 3 weeks of being trapped in the house, saying, Carl, I know you want to do more, and if you're going to be able to do more, you got to build a relationship with the people in power. And so there are people who later are accused and prosecuted, tried for genocide, but his counsel, I look back and just shake my head when I think, what would I have done without him?
Yeah. It's amazing how many times they were able to not have to open up that gate, because had they come in and found that young man and that young woman, we probably all would have been killed.
Very possibly, very possibly. And you look back at so many of those occasions, and actually I still email the pastor. He's retired now, and he sent me an email just the other day saying, I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and I really can't believe how not one of us in the house came to any harm.
Yeah, it's amazing. So the genocide we mentioned lasted 3 months, and for the first month or so, you didn't feel it was safe enough to leave your home. It was during this period that you met, is it Harry? H-E-R?
Harry.
Harry, one of the only other people that were left on the street. And what an amazing guy he was. He stayed behind because there was nobody to take care of these orphans in this orphanage.
Harry, there was never really a safe time, but those first weeks the government wouldn't allow anybody out. It was a 24/7 curfew. But Harry, the couple who was in charge of this orphanage down the street from us, 30 kids, about 5 and under, most of the kids down to a few months of age, they left when the other foreigners left. And Harry, this young man from the Congo, from Zaire at the time, he steps up from being the watchman to being the director of the orphanage. And Harry, if you met him, and you could still meet him, he still lives in Rwanda, has this very disarming smile, a real easy way about him. And that easy way, that, I don't know, maybe natural diplomacy, just I think was key to the survival of those 30 little ones.
Yeah.
Because he had to negotiate with the killers, trying to get food, trying to just get food to the home. He'd get food from the Red Cross, trying to walk it home and get robbed along the way, go back, get some more, get robbed again. Yeah. He just was so tenacious and yet so compassionate. A lot of people are just overcome, understandably, by the horror of the genocide. But when you focus on individuals like Harry, you come away just shaking your head saying, wow, what potential we all have.
When the situation was stable enough for you to venture out of your home, you needed to get this pass.
Yeah, the laissez-passer.
Yeah, and this would allow you to travel freely through the many military roadblocks that were set up throughout the city. So talk about these roadblocks, which sometimes were just a log, right, in the road that were staffed by armed militia, often people you recognize from your neighborhood.
Yeah. We were actually happy when we came to a roadblock that was armed by soldiers, because soldiers were usually more reasonable to deal with. It was these roadblocks, a few beer crates, or some rocks in the road. The people had been told, you can't leave the city, you have to stay and defend. Set up a roadblock in your neighborhood, control whoever's walking through. And so this power that was given to them, coupled together with the fear that the extremists had instilled into them. The Tutsis have killed our president and they'll kill your children, and months of a hate radio broadcast that have been going on, not just blatant hate speeches, which were plenty enough, but also music and comedians with these messages of hatred had done their work in building fear. So when you got to the roadblocks, it was, the document, I'd pull out the document that the colonel in charge of the city had given me, a travel permit. But then you just had to, you were at the mercy of the ones who were there. And why are you going over here to help these, or don't you know we have orphans here? And, what are you doing here anyway? Always suspicious. It was
scary.
It was crazy.
We're talking with Carl Wilkens. His book is I'm Not Leaving, about his experiences in the 100 days of the genocide in Rwanda. Reading your book, you kind of realize how surreal this must have been to see people in your neighborhood who you recognize, who are now armed, seemingly in support of the genocide. You don't know who to trust.
No. And kids often ask me, so how did you know you could trust this colonel, or how did you know you could trust this person? I'm like, I didn't. You just needed an ally, and they're the ones in power. So it's not really a question of whether you can trust them. It's a question of whether they have the potential to do something that will help you accomplish your goal. And my goals during that time were goals given to me by the colonel who's in power. I mean, this guy is in prison today, serving the rest of his life for genocide, crimes against humanity. And yet he pointed me towards 2 orphanages that needed help. I mean, one orphanage had little graves in the parking lot by the time I got there. The children were dying of diarrhea, and all they needed was water. And so it wasn't really who you could trust. It's who could help you to get some food, get some diesel for your vehicle. It was about building those relationships. But when I look back at it, I'm like, nah, I don't know. Maybe trust was there somewhere.
Yeah.
It was more about power than trust.
And so there are times, as you're sort of talking about, you have to deal with individuals who are carrying out genocide, and not just from behind a desk, people who are actually carrying out murder. How do you, and that's a tough situation to be in. How did you deal with that in your own head?
There were definitely times you just were so angry. And they would brag about being able to slice it. You hate to even say these words, but a little one in half with the swing of their machete, and it's like, can these really be humans? And I think the way that navigated through this, one was definitely, like I said earlier, the presence of that pastor, his wisdom. He was a man moving on in years that had seen many things, and he was a great source of encouragement. But also just simply the task at hand, the urgency to get water and get supplies to these orphans. They didn't really give you the luxury to wrestle with these things at that time. It's only when it's
later,
all over that you begin to wrestle with them.
So this was your work. You were providing water and supplies to the orphanages. Tell us a little bit about the orphanages. Were these children abandoned during the atrocities, or were they there before? Where did these kids come from?
It was that the orphanages were existing beforehand, but then parents are looking for any place for the kids during this time. It's your first concern of the mother and father, you might not survive, but is there any hope for my children? And so while churches did not, prove not to be safe, and people were slaughtered in churches, and while government places were not safe, foreigners all left, people, I guess you'd say last resorts, but amazingly, these orphanages, the one near our house did not take in many more. That was 30 kind of from beginning to end. They lost a little one. A mortar fell in the front yard. But the larger one that was operated by a Rwandan family, that one had about 80 kids, but by the time the genocide was done, there were over 400 there.
Wow.
And the other one was it was a Frenchman. So I as I was thinking about a foreign presence, there were about 9 Europeans who didn't, I was the only American that didn't take off, but there were 9 Europeans who stuck by. And this Frenchman had maybe a dozen kids in his house. The house took a mortar, became unlivable. He moved to the basement of the church, and by the time he's done, there's about 200 kids. So they were sort of magnets for children. Sometimes the children would come on their own. I was just with an artist in Toronto a couple months ago he was 9 at the time, and he brought his 5 little siblings. The 6 of them made it to this orphanage after their parents were killed. So here's this 9-year-old boy bringing his 5 little siblings with him to the orphanage. It's a real incredible testimony to the director, Dumas Kasimba, who was the director of that large orphanage, that he could maintain some sort of haven in the midst of all this hell.
And at one point, you get a letter from the president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists basically telling you should get out of there ASAP.
Yeah,
I love your response.
Early on, early on, that's what everybody was doing, and I look back and I'm like, I probably would have done the same thing if I was in his position. It's just like my dad. He was not happy, supporting, and I wouldn't. I look at my son now and I think him married with 3 little kids. This just doesn't make sense, and so I didn't want to be openly rebellious, but I'm like, if you can help me, with what I'm facing here. I just can't leave these people. So help me out here. I don't want to disobey, but what are we going to do?
Yeah. And so then you got the, continue on with your work,
sort
of.
We don't want you to violate your conscience, but we've made it clear we want you out of there.
Right.
And
so your survival and your ability to continue to help others really hinged on providing humanitarian work and remaining neutral. So sometimes this is a bit of a tightrope, even made more complicated by the unpredictability of the soldiers and militia groups. They might come to your door and use a machete and massacre everybody there, or they might come to your door and accept a chicken as a monetary bribe to leave for now. They might be back. You never know if they would come back, if the bribe would work again. There were so many miracles really in this book that you say, how did you manage that? It could have taken a turn in a whole different direction.
Yeah. There's so many uncertainties. And I look back and I just shake my head and say, I don't know. It's like one day at a time. Philip, a Swiss man who stayed at the Red Cross throughout the genocide, he said, Carl, do you have a cement roof on your house? And I said, no. He says, well, by my calculations, you should be dead about 7 times.
Yeah, right.
And I'm just thinking, it's hard. Students ask me, how did you stay safe? And the best I can say is relationships. That's still in the midst of that chaos doesn't explain it, because we know there's other people who had relationships too that didn't preserve their lives.
Well, a kind of good example of that what we're talking about is when you are you're getting help again from the government to move the orphans from an orphanage that was under imminent threat from soldiers. After the orphans and staff were safely evacuated, you returned the next day to collect supplies for the orphanage. Tell us what you found when you got there.
That was so bizarre, because I was so happy the kids were gone from there. It was a nasty part of the city, hard to get supplies to them. And it was actually the same day that they were evacuated. That afternoon, I realized they didn't have their blankets, cooking pots, gets cold at night. So I thanked the colonel for moving them. And then, strangely enough, I said, could you give me a letter authorizing me to collect that stuff over there? Because I knew as I went through roadblocks and everything else, anything from him with his signature stamp was a help. And we get there with Kasikwa, this Rwandan man who had worked with me throughout the genocide, and a guy who actually did buy off killers protecting people in his house with a chicken. or two, each time they came. But Gasik, when I pulled into the parking lot, it's empty. We're like, okay, this is good. There's a bunch of sniper fire on the left-hand side, so we go around to the right, and boom, we come face to face with a militia leader and about 12 of his guys, the same guys, I'm sure, who were there 2 days earlier when we were there and they wanted to massacre everybody. I'm sure they were there earlier that day when the government soldiers came. Now they're back looting the place. They've got an assault rifle in one hand and they got miscellaneous orphan clothing. I don't even remember, but they've got stuff in their other hand. And now we're face to face, and I'm thinking, oh boy, this is the worst thing I could imagine. And now they're going to kill me, and they're angry. They didn't get to do their massacre, but I remember that letter. I pulled the letter out. And this whole idea of presence, I've thought about it later. The colonel obviously isn't with me, but in that letter, there's this presence as I hand it to him, and the leader reads the letter, and of course, the orphans need their stuff, and he barks orders to his guys to help me load the truck. And so one moment I'm sure they're going to kill me, and literally 20 seconds later I'm walking into the orphanage with these guys behind me, and I'm like, well, look, if you lay some blankets down on the floor and put things and carry them out to the truck. And they help me load my truck. They help me find another bigger truck in the neighborhood. We worked together for a couple hours.
It's amazing. Now let's talk about Angelique. You organized a biscuit distribution program to hand out high-protein biscuits from the UN to orphans living with families in the neighborhood. Angelique was a team leader in this program and is wounded in a bombing. And because the Red Cross Hospital is so inundated with wounded, they can't help her. So it's up to you.
Kind of became a little neighborhood first aid doctor guy. And in the evening I'd get home and go to different neighbors, change dressings on wounds and things. And often I ended up at Angelique's house last, and she had quite a couple nasty wounds that I was, disinfecting and changing the bandages. And she had volunteered to help, and she was good at crowd control. And when we were distributing stuff, she really could handle the people. And here, it was my last stop, usually in the evening. I'm doing this by candlelight, changing her bandages, talking, getting a little acquainted. And for some reason one evening I just said, do you want to pray? And she's like, oh, please, And so I was even praying with this lady. I'd gone there with the Adventist church and wasn't, a pastor as such. But people see a foreigner and come in and they're connected with a church, and they think you're a missionary. I mean, when we are a type of missionary. And so for 2 weeks I'm changing her bandages, and it was interesting. I'd sometimes show up at her house and there'd be a couple soldiers or a couple of militia people, but I'm like, well, that's what they do in Rwanda. They visit when people are sick or recovering. Didn't think much of it until the genocide ended, and well, I don't know. What do we say?
Yeah, she was on the other. She was part of it. She
gets killed.
Yeah.
When the city is taken over, and I'm shocked to find out. Just the next day, how she had been one who had been preparing the list. And then it's strange, it's like a memory flashes back in my mind of a time early on in the genocide when this woman had stopped us at a roadblock and fiercely harassed us, harangued the people in my car. And I had never put together that woman in fatigues and this Angelique in regular clothing at the church distributing biscuits until after the genocide, when all of a sudden I'm like, you said she was making lists. That was the same face in fatigues as that face at the church distributing biscuits.
Yeah. I have to say, I was shocked when I read that part of the book. So let's talk about part of your work today. You're visiting schools and talking with students about your experiences in Rwanda. And there's a letter from a student. I'm going to read part of it. Mm-hmm. Dear Mr. Wilkens, so our teacher tells us we're having a speaker come in to talk to us about Rwandan genocide. I'm like, darn, what a way to put a damper on my day. So I'm taking this class for a reason, but at the same time, it's really hard to go from human rights atrocities to physics or writing or whatever I have in the next block. And then you show up and you start talking and you're funny, really funny, and everyone's sitting there wondering if we're allowed to laugh at the genocide speaker. And you answered that for us. Yes, you have to laugh. You have to look at the bright side. Instead of having a bunch of weeping, depressed teens, you left us a group of hopeful people. I didn't expect that. Signed, a Lexington High School junior.
Yeah, you never know how people are going to respond, and yet we've been doing this now full time for 5 years. I think my wife and I were only home 3 times last school year. but we're finding more and more, whether we're in China, Russia, was in Jordan in December, or here in New England, that people are responding to these stories with the desire to make a difference. And you know, this girl, really thoughtful kid. It's a challenge I face when I'm in a classroom. What do they have next period? And I can't just tell these stories cerebrally. It's not like anybody just needs the facts. We need to somehow step into the shoes of the people who are in those situations. And then all of a sudden the bell rings and they've got to go to another class. So I really count on teachers. You know, I ask students, please afterwards, write a little bit about some of these stories. Talk to your friends, talk to your parents, talk to somebody about them. Because these are heavy issues, and if you're just being introduced to them, you know, it's not something we're meant to deal with alone. And yeah, I don't know that I'm always that funny, but I did have a funny monkey chicken story for her. We were just trying to communicate to the students how normal life was in Rwanda before this thing exploded, and that this kind of hatred, this kind of violence can happen anywhere. You know, we often think, well, we're civilized and we're insulated from it. And I think, well, if we're so civilized, why do we go to Rwanda and based on people's passports decide who as an international community we would help and who we would not help? That doesn't sound very civilized to me. So we got a lot of questions we have to ask ourselves.
And you and your wife, Teresa, have founded an educational nonprofit, World Outside My Shoes. So tell us about the mission and what your organization is.
Basically, we just want to support teachers who are teaching about human rights, Holocaust, genocide in the classroom with some live testimony. And so this is a little nonprofit set up to facilitate that, and hopefully we'll be able to grow it so that others who have gone through these experiences will have a platform to be able to share their stories too, because we're really passionate about the power of stories to inspire service, and the empowering part of service that gives the stories. You know, if you hear a story and you don't do anything, you can be worse off than before you heard the story. And if you're just always doing, you know, then without the stories, there's no fire, there's no spark, and it becomes duty and drudgery. So this cycle of stories inspiring service and service empowering stories, I think are two of the most powerful tools we have to really change our world.
One of the things I did like about the book too at the end is you sort of update us on what's happened to everybody. You know, who's in jail, who's alive, who's not, and I know we don't have a lot of time for the story, but the baby, you get a Catholic nun hands you a baby. The baby has a happy ending.
Yeah, I just saw her last summer, in fact, after we've written the book, and she just graduated from high school,
Wow.
top of her class.
Oh, that's
and
great.
you find those stories, the orphan kids who I've met, you know, so they're attorneys, they're electrical engineers, and even, you know, the collective amazing part of all of that is how Rwanda has got one of the lowest crime rates, it's got one of the fastest growing economies in the world, it's got a law and new constitution says 30% of our decision makers in government are women, and so as a result, 56% of the of the seats in parliament are filled by women. And the role of women rebuilding and leading out and healing this country, it's astounding. It's exciting.
So you get back there quite a bit then?
Once or twice a year, group of students, group of teachers, basically anytime anybody has a ticket, back we'll go.
Well, the book is I'm Not Leaving, about the experiences that Carl Wilkens had during the 100 days of the genocide. Thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate you sharing.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
And we should mention that you're on the Cape this week giving presentations to students at Harwich and Dennis Yarmouth High Schools. And there is a presentation tonight open to the public, 7 p.m. at Harwich.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
tonight.
great. All right, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I'm Mindy Todd. Thanks for listening.